You're listening to Nightlight Radio Network. This is Dr. Bob Hieronimus, co-host of 21st Century Radio. We are happy to present this rebroadcast of our show on Nightlight. Our guest tonight, for the full 2 hours of the show, is someone I hugely respect and admire for the work she's done bringing to light the accomplishments of women throughout history. Her name is Max Dashú, and her historical research is comparing the many cultures of the world, searching for the spheres of women's power, was instrumental in our own research into the secret life of Lady Liberty. We studied her suppressed histories archive and interviewed her extensively, and then relied on her enormous intellect and memory during our fact-checking stage. Tonight, we have invited her back to talk about her own new book that was released about the same time as our Lady Liberty book, and we'll be touching on both of them a little bit tonight. The title of Max Dashú's new book is Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Religion from the years 700 to 1100. Now, I'm going to read to you part of a paragraph from page 330 of this book by way of introduction to the topic because, as it turns out, studying women in the European folk religions of the early medieval period reveals an entirely new perspective on the role of women in the past. Quote, in spite of everything that we've been taught about the profoundly secondary status of the female, what women did in their spiritual realm mattered. The wise women had oracular authority and healing wisdom and ceremonial leadership, even after being stripped of any institutional base. Now, these female spheres of power faced intense challenges from the church, from the state, and from within the patriarchal family. Sexual politics was closely bound up with witchcraft and with the cries of witch and whore in England, and with why the Spanish treated burning at the stake as a female punishment. Now, this book is compelling exploration of language, archaeology, medieval literature, and art. In it, Max Dashú pulls the covers off of heritage known to few but scholarly specialists. She has put the common woman at the center of her focus, and this results in a very different European history than what is usually taught. Join us tonight as we explore the sagas, the laws, the illuminated manuscripts, and more to uncover the spiritual leadership of women and the goddesses, fates, and ancestors they've revered. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Max Dashú.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Well, let's start by describing the ethno-historical approach you take to history. What do you do differently from the history we learned in school?
Oh, that's well put, because it's really, there are historians who are taking this approach now, but it's still not something that you see in basic education, in the main public education. And what this does, number one, is it puts women at the center, which is not what happens in our textbooks. Women are really a side note and afterthought. And it puts the common people at the center. And looking at their culture in this period of 700 to 1100, this is something that what you're taught in school is very much about the church, about the feudal order. You're not really getting a very good picture at all. The common woman is the farthest hid into the farthest corners as far as our education, if she's really mentioned at all. And so what was that culture like? An ethno-historical approach goes through language. It goes through cultural names, named ceremonies, references to spiritual practices that were attributed to women, associated with women. And that is completely absent from our education, even at the graduate level. Yeah. This is not something that you commonly see being addressed, in the universities or really in culture-wide. So there's a lot of things about festivals, about prophetic practices, about healing practices, the runes, how people saw dreams, and especially in the third chapter of Witches and Pagans, I'm talking about the names of the witch. And because what we were taught in school, and this is still pretty much in all of even the Halloween culture that we get every year, is, this sort of demonized idea of the witch, a green old woman riding on a broomstick with a wart on her nose. And, really not usually associated with the wisdom traditions. And what the linguistic survey that I did uncovered was that far from the demonized stereotype of the witch as an evil-doing woman, as ugly, all these things, really, if you look in the languages, in the ethnic cultures of Europe, the titles that they gave to witches meant wise woman, prophetic woman, oracular woman, diviner, herbalist, healer, shapeshifter, doer, dreamer, the truth sayer. There's a whole lot of honorific titles that very much show that this is a spiritual role. This is a spiritual role of leadership that people were looking at. And there's a couple places in my whole long 40-some years of writing this book, I kept uncovering certain keystone quotes from priestly sources because they're the literate class. So anything that we know pretty much, unless it's archaeological, was in some way recorded by them. And there's one place where there's a penitential book that was written by a Frankish priest in the 800s up in northern France. And his penitential, what those books were, was the priesthood would try to stamp out the pagan customs, the heathen customs, which were really basically ethnic religion, is all they were. They were folk culture. And so he is scolding about how people are bringing offerings to stones and trees and well springs. And so about 1,000 years ago, an Anglo-Saxon translator copied this penitential, but he did something very interesting that tells us a lot about the texture of the culture, the nature of the spiritual culture that is being campaigned against here. And so I'll read you the quote that he translates this from Latin into Old English, and he editorializes by adding a little commentary. So here's the original. Some men are so blind that they bring their offerings to earth-fast stone, and also to trees and to well springs. And then, the original French cleric is blah, blah, blah about how stupid and idolatrous this is. But the Anglo-Saxon translator contextualized the passages by adding a revealing phrase to it. And he says, Swa Wiccan teacheth, ask the witches teach. And so this shows us that the Anglo-Saxons, 1,000 years ago, still understood witches within the context of heathen ceremony. And so non-Christian ceremony, these are old reverences of an earth-based tradition. And so, we're seeing animist reverence of the witches for earth, trees, and water. So that's very different than the devil worship that we were all force-fed as an explanation of what witches were up to.
Well, thank you. That's an in-depth answer, all right. I just wanted our listeners to know that you've been working at this for a really long time. You founded the Suppressed Histories Archives in 1970 to research global women's history and heritages. Your legendary slideshows bring to light female realities hidden from view, and your collection of over 40,000 images have been used in hundreds of slideshows which you have presented at universities, conferences, and venues around the world. Way to go. That is extraordinary. We were so happy to be able to contact with you during the process of writing our book, which only took us 6.5 years.
Yeah. Long process. Right?
Yes, it does. It is. Why do some historians disapprove of mixing historical and spiritual themes, and why do you say that not mixing spiritual themes into historical interpretation is a distortion?
Yeah. Well, the ideology says the standard thing is a stance of pretended objectivity. I think that there is a rationalist, linear, masculine, mechanistic bias to a lot of the way that academia has done things, has done analysis of history and culture. As I was saying, there's this linear bias that is seen as being the objective bias, but there's not an admission of the way that these assumptions structure the cultural record. And so, on the one hand, you've got the mechanistic, rationalistic bias of Western academia, and then there's maybe an indigenous perspective or an earth-reverent perspective that looks at the evidence really differently. And in fact, there are scholars that do social history, that do ethnohistory, who do understand the importance of the texture of culture. This is the framework that everything happens within. But, there's for example, in interpreting archaeology, what are you going to call things? And so there's taboos in academia. Using the word goddess, for example, is a taboo. And they insist on boilerplates like the term fertility idol, or maybe fertility goddess, but goddess cannot be used alone. It has to have this little fertility stamp added to it, or Venus figurines. In an Aboriginal context, people might be much more likely to look at those and say grandmothers, ancestral mothers, or holy women, or whatever. There's sacred women, goddesses even. So there's different ways, and I think a lot of modern feminists look at them and they go goddess, and they don't mean by that the same thing as the male gods of the dominant religions, but something that's much more integrated into earth, water, air, and fire, something that's part of the natural world and part of themselves, part of their families, part of their communities. And so it's really a battle over naming, and therefore it's a battle over worldview.
Yeah. Well, I guess some people overstate your conclusions and assume you're claiming that Middle Ages was full of feminists. Are you are you claiming that?
No,
no.
It was a very patriarchal period. I mean, and I say that in the book. I just lay it right out. These are patriarchal societies. But I think that we need to get into some more complexity when we look at all of this, and not just have like this monopolarized view, right?
Yeah.
That says, okay, it was all patriarchy, because I do see evidence in the folk cultures for female spheres of power. And that doesn't mean that the family system wasn't patriarchal, and there's a lot of things that we could talk about that are bad. But in this book, what I'm trying to lay out is the ways in which women were at the center of ceremony, leaders of ceremony in many instances. The oracular speech of women was extremely important, for example, in Scandinavia. And there are other references in the penitential books written by the priesthood about women who were herbalists, who were diviners. There are a lot of references to diviners being off back in the woods somewhere and people going to them, and lots of priestly scolding against this. You should not do this. This is not Christian. This is pagan. And so, that's what very much as we see in the Bible, where the goddess Asherah is still present, and there's indications that the common people in Israel were revering her.
Oh, yeah.
And as we read Kings and Chronicles, there's references to that, and references to the repression as well. So something similar, parallel at least, to that happening in Europe, because you have an aristocratic church trying to bring everything in line with their doctrine. And so, what their method of doing that, one of the major illogical frameworks that they place over the folk cultures, is devil worship. That's how they're interpreting all of the ceremonies, all of the sacred traditions. It's all devil worship. And those who carry it out, and particularly female, this is considered really wrong by them, because there's not supposed to be any spiritual leadership by women. The church at that time, and until very, very recently, was an all-male clergy. Women were barred from the priesthood. And so this, too, was taken as something devilish, something really deeply wrong. And this is a way of enforcing more male dominance inside the society. So we see an evolution, or a devolution, really, in medieval Europe, where there's a loss gradually into early modern times of female spheres of power, like that of the herbalist and the midwife, or the female diviner, the wise woman. These are persecuted categories And so the process of beating that out was really a reformation in a very bad way of European culture. And we are still living with the legacies of that repression.
We certainly
which
are.
has never really been processed.
We need to take a pause here because there's a malfunction in our machinery going on here, and we'll be right back. Our guest is Max Dashú, Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Religion, 700 to 1100, Veleda Press, 2016. Order online at Veleda, that's VELEDA.net, or you can also learn a great deal more at Max's other website, suppressedhistories.net. I always thought that Europe was fully Christianized by the early medieval period that you cover in this book, from the year 700 to 1100 Common Era.
That's the claim.
But you reveal that the Christian church of this time had a main competitor in the goddess. Who was she, and how was she denied or demonized by the church? Now, this is extremely important.
Yes, and there's no single deity. There's no single goddess that I'm talking about. There is a constellation of goddesses who have similar traits. So, she's named in different ways, and a lot of the records by the priesthood, they really tried not to give her native names. And so you have them calling her Diana, goddess of the pagans, or Herodias, who is a figure from the Christian Bible. But in one place, one of these priests flipped through an indigenous name, which is that of the goddess Hola, and he calls her the witch Holda. And by mentioning that one phrase, he puts in another keystone for us. This is another one of these key junctures that I came across, was that, he was saying, the witch Holda, this connects us with a whole horizon of goddess veneration in the common people's culture in Germany, and especially in northern Germany. In southern Germany, they were more likely to call her Perchta. And you have Andra Mari in the Basque country, and you have the Queen of Elfame, or Nickneven in Scotland, and there's a whole spectrum of goddesses, all of which are seen as being... So really, in many ways, earth goddesses, goddesses of wells, goddesses who are riding in storms, especially in the winter nights holiday, and that's the time when they are honored, especially as spinners. And this ties in with a lot of the fate goddess traditions. That's another big grouping in European culture. And so these goddesses of the winter nights are associated with witches. They're associated with the ancestral dead. And also, in the case of Frau Holla, from her pond come babies. So we have that little fragment from Bishop Burchard of Worm talking about the witch Holda that indicates to us that there is a continuity between early medieval culture that the priesthood is railing against as being devil worship, and on the other hand, folk customs and folk observances that persisted among the peasantry, in Germany in this case, for many hundreds of years afterwards, in fact for 1,000 years. And so that's an important link-up, because there is a concerted campaign to wipe all this out, and there are a lot of missing pieces. I call this the ripped shred of women's culture, the ripped web, rather, of women's culture. And we're taking all these little shreds and trying to weave them back together and see that there are connections actually to be read there. We certainly don't have the whole picture, but we have some very significant pieces that give us an outline and a texture to it.
Well, following up on this question, how was the goddess demonized, is a good segue to explain how you were so helpful in our research, The Secret Life of Lady Liberty. As you say on page 330, at the center of the cultural transformation was the development of diabolism, a Christian projection of the devil onto all ethnic deities. It had a lasting impact. The name-calling of devil worship formed the template for repressing goddess veneration and later indigenous religions on other continents. Can you tell our listeners how this name-calling still influences us today through the extremist Christians who call the Statue of Liberty the whore of Babylon? What did they mean by that?
Yeah. Well, see, and that's a way of reinterpreting something which, in my mind, the Statue of Liberty is like a reservoir of goddess veneration inside. It's like some of the best that remained in European culture, which in itself was actually quite patriarchal, the U.S. colonial societies, and, just the status of women in this country, very strongly patriarchal in many ways. But that reservoir, it's a goddess symbol. And there's a tendency, as you know from your research, Athena is often shown in images of civilizing mission and manifest destiny. Those European symbols are instrumentalized for this ideology of conquest. So there's a lot of negative ways that is being used on the one hand, or the way that the goddess images are being used colonially. But on the other hand, we have this projection of negativity onto any of these allegorical figures, let's call them, these allegorical goddesses such as liberty, that by anyone who is in opposition to the idea that women have power, women should be free, into the opposition to the idea of liberty whatsoever. And so they have drawn on this long-standing historical pattern of demonizing the female, demonizing goddesses, and, especially drawing on that line from Revelations about the whore of Babylon. They are basically rescripting all this to once again attack female power or any symbolism having to do with liberty in this particular case. So that's what's going on there. And another piece of it is that the issue of, I call this diabolism, the projection that the deities of other religions or the spirits of other religions are really devils, are really the devil. And this is basically a religious supersessionist idea where they're projecting onto other societies, they're all bad, and what we have, our religion, is all good, and we have to make them adopt our religion. So it's highly authoritarian. And that formation of the devil worship ideology in Europe, which was propagated against the pagan cultures, against the ethnic goddesses and the common people, is then exported after 1492 into the Americas and in all the world conquests by Europeans in Africa and the Pacific and other places. And they begin to use that as an ideological tool of conquest. And they're saying, well, we have to conquer and enslave the Indians, and we have a right to do that because they're Christian, they're pagan, and we're actually bringing them all the blessings of civilization. And so diabolism was very important. If you look at the early engravings, starting in the 1500s and then going on for the next couple hundred years, about American peoples, there is a lot of that shot through it. And, for example, pictures of the deities of the Haitian people in the late, I think it's Theodore de Brie, made these engravings, and showing those deities as devils. And, these fantastic figures that have 3 breasts and animal heads and all these kinds of things. And, this is a very negative way of viewing other cultures. It's not partnership mode in any way. There's no room for real treaty or friendship or even diplomacy because it is top-down.
Yes.
We got the right thing, and we're going to force you down your throat and get out of the way because here we come.
Yep, the domination philosophy of patriarchy. Well, we got a little shameless self-promotion time, friends. Visit our website at www.secretlifeofladyliberty.com and view the gallery where we have images of the Whore of Babylon posted as well as hundreds of other images of Lady Liberty, plus ordering information for a new book, www.Secret Life of Lady Liberty. Now, our hundreds of illustrations can't compare to your 40,000, but
well, I only have 140 in my book.
Oh, is that all? Okay.
But I had to render them all.
Whoa, boy, what worth that is.
Searching out copyright permissions for pictures that I don't even know where I got them all those many decades ago, was just easier to redraw them.
Well, now let's go back to the women in European folk religion from 700 to 1100 max. Why do you value folk culture as a form of history?
It is the culture of the people, and it is basically a map of values inside those cultures. And when we're looking for women's culture, there's very little recorded. And so by looking at the evidence about ceremonies they performed or beliefs that they had, we start to learn something about the texture of their lives and what they valued, what they honored. There's a lot of references to the sacred wells and stones and things like that. So we're seeing an aspect of European history, actually, that is not normally taught. And I think it's well worth knowing, especially because suddenly you see women looming very large in that picture.
Mm-hmm. Well, is it the only form of history from the common people that we have access to?
Is what?
Folk religions?
Folk religions. Well, that's a very broad
Folk
thing.
culture.
And I should just say that, this whole research that I've done is very interdisciplinary. So I'm looking at language, the linguistic origins of words, and what that says about the older religious philosophies, you could call them, or spiritual philosophies. In other cases, it's archaeological, because we have megalithic monuments, we have references to ceremonies being done at megalithic monuments. There are references to birth, and one of the pictures I have in the book is from Anglo-Saxon manuscript called the Lachnunga, and it's an herbal compendium, and in their scripture, this is all written by clerics, right? They have pictures of snakes weaving through the pages on childbirth.
Oh, yes.
So it tells you something about that which is otherwise hidden in the culture. Because we know how people farmed. I mean, these are things that they cover in, standard medieval studies, and they talk about the class system of serfdom and all of that. But you don't get much idea of the texture of people's lives. And one of the things that comes out, for example, is we have this idea of the witch's wand, which is, all our fairy stories is full of this. And so we find actual archaeological evidence of oracular women using wands, having ritual stabs. And so I really give a lot of documentation about that, because the description of what people did in their lives is history. That's what you could call social history or ethno-history. And, not just who were the kings, who were the dynasties, what wars did they fight. And those stories never say anything really about the suffering of the commoners whose fields were being trampled under the chargers' hooves during these battles, but to really get an idea of what life was like for women then, people then, but, really looking at the women who are so invisible otherwise. Because if you crack a book on medieval culture, you're going to find 1 million crucifixes, 1 million churches, some Madonnas, and, that stuff is all there, but it's not a really balanced look, because there is this other stuff which is from below. It's the deep strata of culture that hasn't yet been displaced by Christianity or by the priesthood.
Well, how was nurturing Mother Earth transformed into the sexualized and demonized figure of Luxuria? And please tell us what this somewhat disturbing repeated image of a woman with snakes suckling her breasts is supposed to be all about. What does that symbolize?
Okay, well, in the earliest period, and this is mostly Frankish symbolism, so it's like basically northern France and a little bit over into Belgium, the Rhineland, they have numerous Christian scriptures have Earth represented. She's in the margins. She's literally in the margins. But she's sitting there, sometimes under a tree, with a snake suckling at her breast, or sometimes she has babies at her breast. Sometimes she has animals. She'll have a bullock on one side and a snake on the other. And the representation is in some way showing her as the Great Mother, so that there can be humans, animals, and snakes all at her breast. She is the life giver in this symbolism. So it's a sacred symbolism. And even the Christians are still adding her. She may be next there in the corner beside a crucifix or a scene of the Last Judgment, but she's there. This is around 800, 900, the art that I'm talking about. And we have one set of 4 bronzes, which is the 4 elements, and so the element of earth is shown, a sculpture of a woman with the snake at her breast in just this way. What happens is that the priestly ideology of the 7 deadly sins comes into the picture, and you have the theologians torquing this symbolism around, which I believe is really culturally specific to this part of the world. I don't know I've seen images from India with snakes coming out of the vulva, but not anything like from the breast. And so she is culturally specific to northern France and the Rhineland way of showing Mother Earth. And what happens when luxuria is brought into it is, again, this demonizing. So now her naked breasts have serpents at them, but it's becoming more and more scary. They're chewing on her breasts. They're gnawing on her. It's like painful, and it becomes a punishment. Rather than her power of nurturing, it becomes a divine punishment on an evil female figure. And she really ties together, as luxuria, she ties together with Christian ideology of Eve and the fall, and woman as the sexual temptress, and how she has to be punished, and also Eve's association with the snake and the tree. So all of this gets reinterpreted in a really negative way by the theologians, and this art begins to show up in Romanesque churches. And from about 1,000 years ago up through the 1300s, she becomes more and more demonized, and also, being made into an old woman with long hanging breasts, and the serpents are tormenting her. And so you can see this very strong shift in the way she's valued, from being revered to being reviled.
Reviled, yes. Well, the fates, on page 6 you say, quote, "The fates cast a long reflection across millennia of European folk culture. They were older than the Indo-European migrations that divided the Celts and Italians from the Germanics and the Balts and the Slavs. Who are the fates, and what do the women's ceremonies performed in their reverence reveal to us?"
Well, first, the naming of the fates is, varied in the different languages across Europe. The word fata in the origin of the word for fate that we're using here is from a Latin word which means to speak prophetically. And so they are prophetic speakers, but also ordainers of that which will unfold in a person's life. And very often, for example, the ancient Greeks and Romans talked about them as spinners who spun out the thread of each person's life. And you see that reflected in a few places in the Icelandic sagas, where you have one saga where there's a hero who is born, and it shows the fates fastening the threads that they have spun, and basically connecting him to certain times and places and peoples, in the course of his life. And so there's this idea that these are not beings as personalities, but much more a philosophical way about talking about the unfolding of reality and the powers that are at work. And so, but especially at birth and death, those are the two bookends to a human life. And even the gods are supposed to be subject to these fates, which you see occasionally popping up in the Greek material and also in the Norse. And so those are the better known written traditions. But here again, if we look into the folk culture of the Czechs, for example, they call them sudice or sudičky, and this means the female judges. It just means the judges, feminine form of the word. And so there's a lot of forms of the fates as threefold goddesses. The Greeks, the Romans, the three weird sisters in English, and the Flemish and the Dutch had forms of that also. Die Dreiegezuster. Very Slavic languages have these forms. And they're usually threefold. And this can be, as with the Norns, past, present, and future. Actually, the names of the Norns are a little more, they're deeper than that, because they literally mean, urth means became. That's the oldest fate.
We're going to have to pause here. I'm sorry to break in there, Max. Max Dashú, Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Religions, 700 to 1100, Veleda Press, 2016. Veleda is spelled VELEDA.net. Veleda.net. You can also learn a great deal more on Max's other website, suppressedhistories.net. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio with our guest, Max Dashú, goddess scholar and historian. You can order her DVD, Women's Power in Global Perspective. We need to get some more of these DVDs. Again, if you want to order that, it's at www.suppressedhistories.net. Go up to her website. Friends, you can spend weeks there, maybe even a month, just hanging out there learning. It's just great to know this stuff. Wow. Well, now let's examine the most obvious Roman influence on Lady Liberty, a Roman goddess named Libertas. Please tell us who she was and how the American Statue of Liberty is different from the Roman Libertas.
Well, gosh, how it's different. Well, you have the eagle headdress that I referred to earlier, the Statue of Liberty the Freedom Statue that's on top of the Capitol building. The Statue of Liberty itself, I think, clearly she's named after Libertas in the Roman context. And you have this idea of the one who frees slaves that is part of the history in Rome. Shrines that were built to her, some of which were actually governmental shrines. That you have various rulers having these temples constructed to her on the Aventine Hill. And there is that idea of the freedom cap that I talked about a little bit earlier on. But let's see here. What else do I have about Libertas? Well, the Roman robes, of course, very much connecting her with the Latin tradition, the tablets of the law that she's carrying, and you've got the date of the American Declaration of Independence on there, so very much in the mode of the liberation theme all over again. And we talked about the broken chain. Let's see, what else do I want to say about her? One thing I wanted to mention is that in addition to Libertas, this is one of those personified virtues types of goddesses. In other words, it wasn't necessarily a goddess that rose up out of the folk culture as far as I know, but there were other forms of goddesses that were, like, for example, Diana in particular, her temple was a refuge for slaves, for fugitive slaves. And that's another interesting connection of the goddess tradition, is that you have this idea of sanctuary being connected specifically with goddess temples. Artemis Ephesia is another example. So I'm just throwing that in there. But Libertas became, like, sort of in the classical Roman terms, the matron of liberated people, to the freed people. And the diadem was replacing any of the other suggested ideas for the headdress. So she's wearing a crown with the rays. So the idea that not only is she holding the torch, but also she's radiating light from her very head, and people are looking out from that head with its 7 points of light, just able to climb up inside there and view from within her.
By the way, do you think that meditating on an image or qualities of Lady Liberty, can they inspire a woman or man today? And if so, how?
Oh, I do think so. I think that, meditating on divine forms, for atheists, they're going to say, well, it's all a fantasy, but the human consciousness is something that really resonates with symbol, and we can really infuse ourselves with intention and with awareness by those kinds of meditations. I know that certain people, for example, Selena Fox has really found, I think she founded a Lady Liberty League or something like that.
Yes.
And that's been a very important focus for her. And so it's sort of like the fusion of the social consciousness with the spiritual consciousness and the way that those interplay between each other. It's a really good mobilizing force for change. Mm-hmm. And, there are there's a lot of different forms that concept of liberty can take. It wouldn't have to necessarily be the Statue of Liberty. You could come up with, even the goddess Kali has those aspects in her. So there's many forms that has assumed through all these different cultures. But I think that, this is something like teachers like Amachi from India talk a lot about being able to focus and attune to divine forms. For that matter, the Sufis also do, in order to transform your own consciousness to create change within your being, right, so that you are sort of pulling yourself through using these symbols and using the power of your consciousness to focus. It's a form of concentration that ultimately is a way of manifestation. You're going to manifest your desire or your goal that you're attuning to.
Well, what are certainly there's certain kind of actions that you refer to that we can all do and these are actions, of course, not just meditative, if we awaken the female divine within. Being an artist, when you work for a long period of time, Max, on any particular project, and you start feeling that energy come up through your body, it is such a glorious experience. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons why I just wish any and everybody create anything, especially if it's positive, because during that process of creation, your consciousness is elevated considerably. I mean, many of us artists, you only get one meal a day, and that back in the old days, and actually not so old days long ago, but during that process, when you're alone in your study, in your studio, working 8, 10, 12, 16 hours at a time, every day, 5, 6, 7 days a week, you become transformed. You become another being.
Yeah, I think that's true, and this is one reason I like to also work with music, doing art.
Oh.
Because there's this elevation that happens, and that's another reason why I've had a hard time. I mean, I remember long ago, politically, I would try to do art that I wanted to make people understand about some of the unjust things going on, but it was too hard. I just find it too hard to paint scenes of horror.
Yeah.
I want to focus on things that inspire.
I can understand.
And so, I found that out pretty early on.
Well, one of the toughest pieces I ever had to do dealt with Monsanto. You're familiar with Monsanto?
Yeah.
Obviously, I think of them as public enemy number 1 through 600. They're almost like General Electric or Union Carbide. You can put them in the same class along those lines. But before I know we're running out of time, and there's let's try to. Well, there's something, Max. I started this hour with an indication of how the rising of consciousness of goddess, of environmental awareness, of social justice for women and indigenous people are all connected. Would you like to talk about whether how goddess reverence affects better status for women or the planet as a whole?
Sure. I mean, for the planet, we can just look at the disrespect and the violation of Earth that's been going on. I mean, this has been a mounting process that just keeps getting more and more intensified. And so we have to have a reference for the basic, the Earth is our mother. Everything, what we drink, what we eat, it all comes from Earth. And this is a state of sacred beauty. Ultimately, I mean, the Earth could be a paradise. It is a paradise. It was a paradise. There's so many teachings and sacred things that are manifesting through the way that life is organized, the way that it grows, the way that it flows, all the harmonies. But here it is being violated and destroyed. So, to restore that reverence and to have people really feel it integrally will mobilize them to action. This is the interplay between the reverence and the need to act, because that is like aside from any kind of symbolic rituals where you're offering up symbols, you have to do something. You have to change things so that this violation can't continue. Mm-hmm. And then on the human level, this is also where justice comes in. The violence against women, against children, the violence against people of color and indigenous people, there's so many different ways where the justice imperative comes in. And all of those wrong and maladaptive acts are something that take us away from our ultimate nature. They're marginalizing everything that's good and positive about humans, and it's picking up on the greedy and the negative and the bloody and the poisonous aspects. And so I think that there is a way in which the restoration of that divine female in our consciousness, however we think about it, you don't have to be a theist. I think that the whole theist-atheist polarity is an artifact of patriarchal religion. Life is sacred. Water is sacred. You don't have to believe in beings that don't exist, to have a reverent attitude towards what is sacred in nature. And so, if we move from that and we move from a place of love, move from the heart in how we relate to each other, then that is manifesting Goddess, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
That is the ultimate.
Unconditional love. That's how basically I've always felt about it. Max Dashú, goddess historian, restoring women to cultural memory through the suppressed histories of archives. We're going to have to pause here for our break at the top of the hour. Okay, our guest tonight, this hour, I've been looking forward to this interview for months, is Max Dashú, Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Religions 700 to 1100, Veleda Press, 2016. You can order online at Veleda, VELEDA.net. Veleda.net. You can also learn a great deal more at Max's other website, suppressedhistories.net. There sure has been a lot of suppressed histories, friends. Okay, what is the relationship, Max, between the fairy realm or the fae people to the fates, enchantment, and the spiritual world?
Yes, well, this is related to the last question about the fates, because the word fata, as I explained just now from Latin, means to speak prophetically. And so this gave us the word fate. Then in the Romance languages, in Spanish and French and various related languages, fata changes on the tongues of people. You know how language will kind of migrate, the sounds will change. We can't really understand Shakespeare as well as we can understand modern English because there are shifts that happen. And so it becomes fata or fada or hada in Spanish. It becomes fée in French. And this is all uncontroversial if you just look it all up in an etymological dictionary. And the French word féerie, meaning the realm of the fairies, the realm of destiny, the magical realm, gets adopted into English as the word fairy. And so, then we have to ask, well, what are the fairies? Because we have this idea about Tinkerbell and, Disneyfied ideas or Victorian ideas about fairies. But in medieval Europe and in the folk cultures, fairies were bound up with the ancestral dead, with the land, and there's you'll always see fairies appearing at powerful natural sanctuaries like springs and lakes, or in forests, the forest of Brocéliande in Breton culture, and so they are potent spirits, and often pictured as female, not exclusively. But there's been some very interesting scholarship showing how in the folk culture people really did see the fairies as bound up with the ancestral dead. And that's a piece that a lot of people don't know about. Mm-hmm. Ancestor reverence is a subject that I go into in this book, and I didn't really plan to be talking about it, but as I uncovered more information, I could see that this was something that was going on. And it's an important connection of Europe to the rest of the world. When people think of ancestor veneration, they usually think of China. But this is something that was also very generalized in Africa, in the Americas, and other parts of the world, in the Pacific. So Europe also had this. And this is one of the points in the book that I think is really important, is what connects us to the other peoples on this planet.
Why was the distaff, or spinner's wand, significant in mythology and ceremonial practice?
I didn't catch, there's something blipped out there. Why was what?
Why was the distaff?
The distaff, yes.
Or the spinner's wand. I always misinterpreted that as a magic wand.
Well, no, you didn't. It's not a misinterpretation at all.
Oh.
It is, in fact.
Well, then that's great.
Okay, literally, the distaff refers to a staff that you wrap flax around. So the in distaff means flax in Anglo-Saxon language. And this is also where we get the word bedizen. And originally, to bedizen was to drape the raw flax that's been combed out and is ready for spinning, or the wool, around the staff. Then the spinner would pull it down off the staff, and she would twist it with her fingers, and then she would hang it. The drop spindle would twirl, and it would twist the fiber, and it would help draw it out in spinning. So it has a function. It's a function of a tool for spinning. But symbolically, what you said is exactly right. It was a magic wand, and we see it being referred to that way in the sagas of Scandinavia, in all kinds of different folk traditions in different parts of Europe, and connected with witches. In the Norse world, though, the seeresses of the Norse were literally called staff women. Oh. And so we know this from the Old Norse literature. And we also know this now from archaeology, because they've found women buried with iron stabs. And after some research, I discovered a Norwegian archaeologist who identified the shape of this staff, the symbolism of it, as a distaff. And when I read this, I had to go look it up, and sure enough, the form, it's a very unusual shape, and I was always looking at it and going, what is this? It's a very strange shape, because it has these spokes about 4/5 of the way up the staff, spokes that emerge out of the staff, flank, the actual body of the staff, and curve outward and then come back together and join up for the top of the staff. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And so when Eldar Heda raised this point, and I checked it out online, and I looked at pictures of distaffs, because usually you see it with the stuff wrapped around it, so you don't know what the stick itself looks like underneath. And they were all in exactly the same shape as the staffs of the Norse Völur, the prophetic women. And so that was that was one of the last big discovery I made while writing this book, which took decades. So it's, the things kind of unfolded. But when I discovered that archaeology, it was like a missing piece fell into place of things that I had already been developing in other chapters of the book, which was, what we talked about with the fates and the symbolism of the fates, or the fairy women as spinners, and the ceremonies that women did around spinning and weaving. And we have testimony from bishops in various parts of Europe scolding women for doing that, for invoking goddesses while spinning and weaving. And then now we have an actual material evidence of women who were spiritual leaders that were buried with this kind of staff. And so that authenticates what the sagas are telling us, that there were women who led ceremonies that's known as seidr, and they prophesy in a trance state in these ceremonies. And so the staff is referred to in descriptions of various völur in different parts of Scandinavia. So it's really beautiful when you have something coming down first through oral tradition and then later written down by the monks, right, in the 1200s. They began committing the Icelandic Edda and the sagas to writing. And then in the process of doing that, they gave us continuity there from what would have been lost otherwise. And so then along come the archaeologists, and they say, well, here is the material background for this. And in fact, the archaeology is what really pulls out this bit about the distaff being a magical wand.
Mm-hmm.
That was what the prophetesses were using, and we don't know how they used it. I mean, they could have been using them for spinning. I think it's an Eyrbyggja saga. One of the sagas talks about a witch named Katja, and some men are chasing after her son, trying to kill him. And so she says, never mind, sit here beside me, and she takes up her distaff and she begins spinning. And the enemies charge into the house, and they can't see him. She's sitting there spinning and looking at them. And so they leave. And so this is seen as a way of casting a spell.
You know, you've been laying the foundation of knowledge in these areas that others can build on, and that can stand on your shoulders for others to take it to higher realms. I'm telling you, I am so impressed with your work. I mean, you're, say, 40 years, but it sounds like you've been at this for thousands of years. and it makes such a difference. Good research is well, there isn't as much of it, as my opinion, as there used to be, because the standards aren't what they used to be. But you have done a marvelous job. Now, I don't want to embarrass you, but I had to pull away from the other questions to make sure I said that, because it's extraordinary. Now, on page 42, you talk about certain tales of women effectively weaving peace in a section that reminded me of the League of the Iroquois and their Council of the Clan Mothers. Can you make the case that some women played an active part in peace negotiations in medieval Europe as well?
Well, you know, I suggest this because I haven't, I've read sources that talk about this. Some of the early feminist scholarship on medieval times brought this out, that women, they're talking primarily about women of aristocratic families who are married off into enemy families. And so these are diplomatic alliances, but very dangerous ones, because these groups, you know, things can shift and they're at war again. And so it was really in the women's interest, because here they are of one clan, and then they marry into this other one. They're losing to influence them. They are trying. They are like a person standing with their foot in two boats that are moving apart, you know, and their children are of the other lineage. So they're going to lose, and Beowulf, the Old English epic Beowulf, shows this very clearly. Women lose big time when there's war.
Yes,
you know,
sure.
and there's a lot of killings go on, and you know they have kin on both sides because of these patrilineal, patrilocal marriages, and so they were really motivated, number one, to make this peace. The metaphor of weaving peace is very interesting. Frøldewebe, the peace weaver, is a term that does occur in several different Anglo-Saxon sources. And so these historians have been suggesting this was actually something that women haven't been given as much credit for as they should have been in, you know, modern histories, because, you know, it was a role they played that was behind the scenes but very influential in, you know, what happened, you know, in advocating diplomatic work, basically, that didn't have that title put to it, but that's what it was.
Well, what do the ethnic names for witches tell us? Now, you talked a little bit about this last hour, but what do the ethnic names for witches tell us about the spiritual gifts and leadership attributed to them in early medieval times?
Well, you know, there's a lot. I have a table in the book that goes on for about 6 pages of ethnic names for witches, and showing the attributes and powers that were attributed to them. You know, they're actually calling, because, you know, witch is an English word. So, you know, if we look at the Slavic languages, the whole family of Slavic languages, Croatian, Serbian, Polish, Russian, Belarus, there are a whole group of names that mean knower. And this is like the term wisewoman in English. And that turns up also in French and Spanish and some other languages. In Norse, they called the witch Fylkinigkona, much knowing woman. You know, and so this is a very different perspective than the demonized view, obviously. And the fact that you could make pages and pages listing titles for witches, you know, as herbalist, as healer, as old woman, as diviner, enchantress. We know in English we have this word enchantress, and if you think about the Latin root there of that word for chant, it goes down to the word for song. Okay, so yes. There incantation is literally singing in. You're singing spirit into something, right? And so we're seeing that as an aspect of the witch. And shapeshifters and fateful women, there's a lot of these different names, and some names even referring to, sometimes it's not clear, are they talking about a living witch, or were they talking about a female ancestor? Or numerous names like that. There's one name that I think is one group of names, I should say, that's very important, that I loved finding this information. And this is where the linguistic analysis is so important, because it takes you into the mind of the culture. And so in Old English, there was a word for witch, libestra, which means basically life woman. Lib is the Old English form, life. It's related to the word for life. And this is not present only in the British Islands, but also in the Scandinavian languages and in Old German. And so the lib, it means life, and it also means medicine. So this is a name, really, you could translate it as medicine woman.
Well, we got some medicine we have to feed our listeners at this time. And our guest, of course, is Max Dashú, Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Religion, 700 to 1100, Veleda Press, 2016, spelled VELEDA.net. And you can also learn a great deal more at Max's other website, suppressedhistories.net.
Hello, this is Professor Joy Porter, author of Land and Spirit in Native America, which is available on Amazon.com. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
Joy to hear Joy Porter again. Really? Oh, we had such good times. Okay, this is 21st Century Radio, and our guest is Max Dashú, Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Religion, 700 to 1100, Veleda Press, at 2016. Order online at Veleda, that's VELEDA.net, or you can also learn a great deal more at Max's other website, suppressedhistories.net. This is an important work. Well, Max, what is the original meaning of heathen, and how does it relate to names for Iberian witches and Norse seeresses?
The heathen in English just means people of the heath, person who grows up in the bush, basically. And, heather is a related word in English. And so this same word existed in German, heathen in various Norse languages. And so they all had relatives to this word, and they all referred, in early medieval times, was used to refer to people who were not Christian, who followed older ethnic ways. So that's been known for a long time, and I came across a really interesting piece because in trying to figure out what the meanings of all these different names for witches were in the various languages, there was a mystery about the Spanish word bruja. And in Portuguese, it's bruxa. In Occitanian languages of southern France and eastern Spain, it is bruixa. And nobody could really explain that. And there have been various strange theories about what this word came from. But in the last 10 years, I ran across a Catalan etymologist. So he's a native speaker of one of the languages that uses this word for witch. And he thinks that it comes from the word for heath. And he gives examples, linguistic relatives to words for heath in those Romance languages to Irish. And, the linguistic case is pretty strong there. So that's another group of languages where there's a pagan connection to this word about heath. And basically what they're talking about is people who live outside urban areas. They're back in the country. They're peasants. And they're ethnic peasants. So this is a group of people that we know heathens to be. They're people who are away from the centers of power because they are the last to actually convert to Christianity.
Whoa, thank you. Well, let's talk about the old woman goddesses who, I may mispronounce this, but I'll do it my best, was called Cailleach.
Cailleach, yeah, the Cailleach.
Oh, Cailleach, okay. And how is she related to ancient megalithic temples in Ireland?
Well, I have a whole chapter on this because the Cailleach is just still very much a living figure in Irish lore. And so there's one figure in particular called the Kalia Vera, which means the hag of Bear, or the old woman of Bear, in the farthest western peninsula of Ireland. This is said to belong to her. And there are references to her in old Irish literature, but especially more so in the folk culture. And so there are names of the old megalithic monuments. Do you know what I mean? I'm talking about large stone structures that are undressed rock, big chambers that were being built over 5,000 years ago.
Like Newgrange?
Newgrange is a well-known example of a megalithic chamber. And so many of these chambers in Ireland are named as the house of the Cailleach, or various other words that they'll use. But they basically refer to them as her dwelling. Sometimes there's a hag's chair outside of some of these places. And so there are a lot of sacred stone stories associated with the Cailleach. And it's actually said in folklore that these monuments were built by her, and that she would either fling the rocks from hilltop to hilltop, so she's a giantess with this tremendous power, or she would be carrying them in a basket, or usually in her apron. And the apron strings broke, and that is how the megalithic stones became scattered. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, we're talking about over the course of thousands of years, many of these were toppled. And so both in France and Ireland, there's a lot of stories about fairy women or spirit women who were responsible for how these stones came to be scattered across the landscape. And so, there's an old woman at the center of these stories, and they are really, really ancient. In Ireland, you have Indo-Europeans settling, and so that's the language that's spoken there now, the Irish language. But they intermarried with the older peoples that were there before. Maybe even, I would say that these are likely to have been the builders of the megalithic monuments. And so we don't know to what degree these stories are traces of these very ancient traditions and how much of it is superimposed by later migrants. But what you do get is a very strong focus on an ancestral woman. And this is a very Aboriginal theme. The old woman from whom came peoples and races, because she gave birth to many, many generations of descendants.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear you talk about Brú na Bóin, or the easier name for me to pronounce is Newgrange, because I've actually visited this megalithic site in Ireland. How is it related to this tradition of the old woman goddess?
Well, Brú na Bóin means there's two ways to translate. One is the house of Boan, and Boan means the white cow. So this is a goddess that is referred to a lot in the Irish literature. It's written down in the Middle Ages, and there are a lot of goddess traditions wrapped around these. This is another of them. But both Boan and the Cailleach Beara is sometimes named in the stories about her, and she's called Bui, which is the same root as Bo in Boan. It means cow. So there's a sacred cow woman. And this is something very, very deep in Indo-European culture. So in Ireland, we have Bui and Boand. The and part means white, so white cow. And in Gaul, there was a goddess called Bovinda. And so again, this is that Boan, Bovinda. You can kind of see how those are linguistically related, the white cow. Bovinda, however, the Gaulish name, has a direct parallel all the way over into India, where you have Govinda, because there's a sound shift. In Western Europe, it was B, and in the Asian, Indo-European languages, the same sound came out as G.
Yeah.
And so Govinda is a title of Krishna, so you have a little bit of a sex shift going on there also. But Govinda is also a title in the litanies of the sacred names of goddess that are still chanted in India. So she's being called Govinda. So there's this very, very, this is a connection that is older than 5,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, these monuments were more than graves, right? They were also sanctuaries of ceremonial renewal and of astronomical wisdom, as their solar alignments show. I was also fascinated by their being covered in these quartz pebbles the cairns would actually gleam in the sun from a distance. It's kind of like some of the old stories dealing with the Great Pyramids, supposedly having the stones almost
they,
that
they,
look like...
They used quartz also. They
Yeah.
used quartz. There was a casing of quartz so that they would have been brilliant
Yeah.
in the sun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, and it's, it's really very illuminating because there are many people in this country who have Irish descent.
Yeah.
And we don't know about all of this, and about these monuments and these sacred places. The astronomical knowledge of many people who are interested in the history of ideas have followed this. And, I went also to Newgrange. Oh, one other thing I wanted to say, Brúna Boan, the primary translation of it that I have found is House of Boan. But Mary Condren, who wrote The Serpent and the Goddess, very good classic text on women's history and heritages, she found a listing of the word brew without the GH at the end, and she says, well, actually it means womb in Irish.
Oh, yeah.
So and that's what a lot of us in the feminist movement have talked about for decades now, is instead of calling these passage graves, which is the archaeological term for Newgrange and Knowth and Dowth and these other monumental chambers with mounds over them, we used to call them womb tombs, because when you look at them, you are actually entering the earth. And, they have stones, megalithic stones, framing the entrance and then making like a vaginal passageway that goes into this uterine chamber. And this is where they were laying the ashes, the remains of the dead, collectively to rest inside these womb chambers. So there's a whole spiritual meaning to these places as a regeneration, a resurrection, rebirth.
At the entrance to Newgrange, there are these very large, not boulders, but they're really long, maybe.
The
curbstones, and they have these spiral designs on them. We bought a lot of them. We just love them. Could you tell us anything about those spirals and what is going on there?
Well, they're really energetic patterns. I think they're showing the flow of life force, flow of power.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm sure there are other meanings encoded into them that, we may not be. There were certainly stories and symbols and meanings attached to them. These are not only found on the curbstones at Newgrange. We've got the triple spiral on the inside, so that when the sunlight penetrated down the chamber on, I think it's the winter solstice, only at that time of year, they had built the monument in such a way that the sun would channel all the way down into the chamber and light up those spirals on the inside of it. There are other spirals like that, and in fact, my favorite, I haven't been able to visit very many of these, but I did get to Newgrange, and I got to Loch Crew. And this is another group of megalithic monuments that are very strongly tied to the Cailleach in oral tradition, because it said that she built them, number one. And the hag's chair is outside the uppermost of all of the chamber, all these chambered circles at Loch Crew. At the very top, there is one that's called Cairn T. And right outside of Cairn T, opposite the entrance, is a stone, a granite seat that looks out across the counties of Ireland. It has a very distant view. And there are traditions that say that the Cailleach used to sit there, and people would come there and also ceremonially sit on it themselves as well. And so it's very interesting, because when I went to Loch Crew and we got into the chamber, the entire hallway that you walk down to go into the central chamber is covered with suns and vulvas, deeply, deeply engraved in the rock. This is, by the way, a monument that's several hundred years older than Newgrange. This is one of the earlier womb tombs.
Mm-hmm.
And in the back wall of the three recesses that come off the internal chamber there are these same kinds of spirals. And it really looks like a map of the realm of dreaming, where spirit is just, it's like the primeval chaos that we all come out of, and we come into human manifestation through the womb,
Yeah.
right? And so there's something about those spirals. They're inchoate. There's no way that there's no order to them. They're just pulsing. And there's this flow being shown by the lines in them. And so they certainly had a very strong meaning, but I think that it is connected with the fact that these are chambers of regeneration.
And with that, we got to take our break at this particular time with our guest, Max Dashú, Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Religions, 700 to 1100, Beleda Press, 2016. Order online at beleda.net. That's VELEDA.net. If you think we want you to buy this book, you're right. You can.
Hello, this is Joanne Shenandoah. I'm a Grammy Award-winning singer-songwriter, Native American Music Award winner, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
We're talking with Max Dashú, Witches and Pagans, Women in European Folk Religions, 700 to 1100, Beleda Press, 2016. And, of course, you can also learn a great deal more at Max's other website, suppressedhistories.net. Well, the kayak, did I get that right? I did. Yeah. The kayak, I got an A- on that. The kayak is first recorded in written historical documents around the year 900 CE. She is, of course, demonized, but also her age is used against her as a form of weakness instead of wisdom. Whoa, that's how, this is crazy. What happened to the status of old women in real life when the old woman goddess was turned into a hag to be feared? I know you touched on this a little, but this always gets me upset.
Yeah. Well, the piece that I'm referring to there in the 900s, they make her into a pitiful old nun who has lost her looks and really would much rather be galloping around with the aristocratic men lovers of her youth. But now she's drinking whey among shriveled hags, and so it's very negative towards the old women. And, this is something that we can see more generally as a theme that, the goddesses, there are a lot of old goddesses. I call her the old goddess, just as a general pattern in European culture, and this is back to the spinners of fate and the women of the winter nights, goddesses like Perchta and so on. And so they become, toward the end of their career, as get made into the witch stereotype. There are some of the stories about the Cailleach also in Scotland and Ireland refer to her. On the one hand, they're seeing that she's this very powerful figure, but the storytellers are taking pains to see her defeated. And so you'll see her ritually done away with by hunters or priests or other male figures. So there's a very strong gendered theme going on through the way these stories play out. And yet, what's amazing, particularly if you read the Book of the Cailleach by Gearoid O'Crualach, an Irish folklorist, he really shows how much there is this very powerful archetype that was preserved. So we're seeing both a negative strand, but we're seeing also the original cultural pulse, very, very strong, of a positive valuation of the Cailleach as a deathless, vigorous, vitality-filled old woman who's an ancestor and who knew how things were done. So the Irish stories say things like, well, the Cailleach lived so long because she never, brought old water in before, brought new water in before finishing the old water, or throwing the old water out. And there were these different cultural themes that they brought up about her as a hunter-gatherer, or the way that she ate that kept her healthy. And so there's this idea that she had a wisdom. She was a teacher on some level of the way things should be done, whether it was farming or whatever else it was. And those stories smack up against the idea that, the priest really knows best, and the old woman is a counterforce to the priest. Mm-hmm. So she's made into a villainous figure who must be subjugated, done away with, even.
So the female elder cannot win, can never be allowed to prevail, because she is a threat to the power of domination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. These are all ideologies, man over woman, lord over peasant, Christianity over any other religions that were really enforced throughout medieval times. And there's the ironic thing is that, in the best of the folk culture, you do not have this enforcement going on. There's this idea. There are also male figures, for example, in the Scandinavian tradition who are participating in the same kinds of ceremonies, similar kinds of ceremonies as the Vura that I was talking about earlier. It's really the common people's cultures that has the best models for cooperative relations between the sexes. But it is a ranked society, and this is the thing when people think about medieval Europe, there is this ranking going on. And this is very dangerous for human societies. Not good things can happen once one group is saying, I'm better than you, and I'm going to run your life for you.
Oh, it's so interesting. You pointed out the Scandinavian countries today are still far more balanced than what we have over here in the United States. Especially,
they had to go through that Viking period where it was very warlike, and they were causing a lot of suffering to a lot of different countries that they were raiding all over the place. They were pirates, but there were ways, and I think that the female sphere of power of the Völler or of the seeresses was very marked in Scandinavian culture. Toward the end of that period, we see them being gradually driven down, and this coincides with the period of conversion. And so you see male warriors beginning to attack and strike the vulva, the prophetess, and some hostility and some combativeness coming in there, repression really of them, and so they fade from the scene finally, and that's really a loss for the culture, but especially a loss for women because they had an authoritative role as the prophetesses.
Well, I found it interesting that the root word for Valkyrie, is that how you pronounce it? Valkyrie is to, Valkyrie is to choose, as in chooser of the slain. And that reminds me of the Statue of Liberty again, whose fundamental message is that the United States is a nation where citizens have the liberty to choose what we believe. Anyway, most of us know that the Valkyrie, because of Richard Wagner's famous opera and the ride of the Valkyrie. Tell us what you found about them, the Valkyrie, when not viewed through a military lens.
Yes, right. And so the thing about the ride of the Valkyries, this is one of the important parts because there are stories both in Scandinavia but also in the Balkans about female spirits who ride through the heavens and the dew from their horses shakes down, or the sweat of their horses shakes down, and that's the dew. Or that somehow they're the dew bringers. And so there's this idea of vital power showering onto the planet, showering onto the earth from them. And so they have this blessing power that is really the opposite of the killing. The Valkyrie is the destiner of the slain that we see in the military cult of Odin. There is another piece, which is the fates again. And this is more of a submerged thing because most of the epics that talk about the Valkyries are concerned with lordly men and their wars, but the Valkyrie as fate, there are some stories, forgetting which saga it is, there are some Finnish princes who are going hunting together, and there's some swan women who come along, and they take these princes as their lovers, and they live together, and the men are like over the moon because it's just so great with these magical women. And then after 7 years or 9 years, they fly away. And so the passage in the saga that's describing this occasion refers to them as women who fate destinies. And so in the military version, it's the fating of death in battle. Mm-hmm. And this is a very strong focal point for European patriarchy is, who's in charge, who wins, who loses, and, the warriors. But there are these other aspects of the fates, and especially the shapeshifters, women who are goddesses who take the form of swans and sometimes take off their swan cloak and become women and then put their swan cloak on and fly away again. That ties in with a much broader group of not just European stories, but really global stories about spirit women who marry mortal men.
But why are priestly penitential manual. Did I get that right? Penitential. Yeah, manuals, important sources of pagan beliefs and practices.
Because the priests were the only ones who could write things down. They're our only source of written records. And it's the written records we have to go on. Everything else is archaeology, or it is whatever has survived in oral tradition. And this is where we get controversial again in academia because, of course, oral tradition, like language, shifts over time. So then the question becomes how much of these stories that have come down to us on the tongues of the common people, how much of this really reflects what was believed a long time ago? And so this is where we get into having to, compare and contrast and kind of see if there's any matches between those different types of testimony. And there is, so that's the really fascinating study, is to see how much correspondence there is. But getting back to the penitential books, we're having priests in the act of attempting to stamp out heathen customs, describing those customs to each other in these manuals. And so very often they're forms of questionnaires, to ask to the people in the confessional booth, did you ever do this ceremony? Do you know any woman who, etc.? And so this is a process of direct confrontation by the church authorities, which are all men, against the common belief and the observances and the festivals and the ceremonies of regular people. And did you believe in this goddess? And did you believe in the three sisters who the old stupidity of the ancients called the fates? There's this very contemptuous language they're using. But they're tracking pagan custom and cataloging it in order to stamp it out. Mm-hmm. And by doing that, they inadvertently preserve evidence of it for us to read.
Well, thanks. At least we got a little bit of evidence anyway. Why were female teachers and birth control practitioners major targets of the ecclesiastical offensive on the folk culture?
Well, because they were major figures in that culture. Mm-hmm. And the priesthood didn't want any competition for their authority. People would, they wanted people to come into the church and pray to get better, and they did not want somebody going to an herbalist who was going to do a smudging of their body and give them herbs and chant over the herbs, maybe invoking deities that the priests don't even, know who they are or approve of. Or, maybe the old Scottish witch is going to tell people, now I want you to drink this potion every day for three times a day, and I want you to walk around this lake every day. So there was like a prayerful ceremony that was accompanying. It was really what you could call holistic medicine, because it wasn't just the pharmaceuticals. It was, the herbs were being given. That's the medicinal part, but also there would have been a ceremonial component, and this is much closer to Native American healing methods.
So, in fact, then, so many people lost their lives or died because they were prevented from other holistic methods of healing. And that's a pretty terrible thing to do to a human being.
Yeah, there was a high infant mortality then. It's really hard to say how much. It would have impacted the survival in some ways, because they certainly were going after people who were effective healers. We still have this dualism today.
You sure do.
AMA versus the holistic medicine people.
Yeah.
And just like then, today, more and more people are going to alternative healers because the doctors are telling them, well, I'm sorry, you have this disease and you're going to die in 6 months.
And that wraps it up. Yes.
Yeah, or just, giving them, basically saying, well, there's nothing we can do. They don't often say that. They will just say it's incurable.
Yes.
But, there are people who are seeking out everything from acupuncturists to all kinds of other touch modalities and herbal methods that are effective. So that's the thing. The proof is in the pudding.
And right about now, we are all totally ineffective because we've run out of time, darn it. This has been so great, Max. You do such a terrific job. God bless you. God
Thank
bless
you,
you,
Bob.
dear.
And I hope people will check out this source book. That's really what it's intended to be.
Well, what a source book. Jeez whiz.
Because this is a hard information to get your hands on, so I just try to pull it all together in one place.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I hope you join us again. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington, and I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus.